Hi, my name is Renata Hansen. Today I will be presenting to you Randall Park's story in American Like Me, where I will be analyzing his rhetorical devices. So to start off, let's give a little bit of background of Randall Park. He is an American actor, comedian, writer, and director. He was born in Los Angeles to Korean parents and has appeared in numerous films and TV. Let's start off with past. So Randall Park's purpose in writing this was to enlighten his readers to ask their family members the stories and experiences from their countries to later pass on the stories through generation. He's also stating that he wants his readers to learn more about the cultures if they're unconnected or unconnected to their parents in some way. The audience is American Like Me readers, and the speaker is Randall Park. The situation is that Park is unaware of his parents' past and disconnected from his culture. Not only is he disconnected from his culture, but he's also disconnected from his parents at an emotional and personal level. So the rhetorical strategies that Randall uses is pathos, paradoxical phrasing, flashback, situational irony, comedy, and many more. Let's start off with paragraph 1 and 2, where I decided to highlight so I can emphasize the main important points in each paragraph. In the light green, we see their struggles and sacrifices are the reason why I am who I am today, my heroes. Here we can see that he's obviously talking about his parents in a grateful, prideful tone. He recognizes his parents' sacrifice in coming to a new country for a better life for him and his brother, and not knowing anyone and not knowing the language and like sacrificing everything they had in Korea to come here for him. Let's move on to the purple. We see too tough a task. I barely know them. If anything, they're more like an instruction manual. They're for setting up and for troubleshooting, but not the most riveting when it comes to the story. Let's start off with these first two sentences. Too tough a task, and I barely know them. So we see that they're very short, concise sentences where he's trying to emphasize his points that he barely knows his parents. However, as readers, we question, how can someone barely know their parents? Later on in the story, it's obviously going to be answered by Park. Let's move on to, if anything, they were more like an instruction manual. Here we see a description of an inanimate object in comparison to his parents. As we know, instruction manuals are straight up to the point, not very detailed, and only trying to say the main points. That's what he's trying to say about his parents, very like reserved parent people, very straightforward, as you can see. Then let's go to the light purple, where it says many American born kids of Korean immigrants. It's not that uncommon. The parents of my non-Asian friends growing up would talk openly about their childhood past, relationship, their struggles. Some would even talk about their sex lives, which to this day I find very weird. Here we see a comparison of the Korean immigrant parent culture and the American culture, where we see that the Americans are more lenient, more open, while Koreans are more reserved, more personal. He also uses, which to this day I find very weird, as a comedic, like to break the tone, the somber tone of not knowing his parents. We're going to see this a lot throughout this essay, as obviously he's a comedian, so we see this a lot of his personality. Let's go on to paragraph 3 and 5. Let's start off with the blue, where it says, I don't mean to make them sound cold or emotionally unavailable. They were great parents. Here we see that he's connecting back to paragraphs 1 and 2, where he states that, again, they're very reserved people, that they're like emotionally there, obviously, but they don't share a lot. However, he emphasizes that point 1 again. They were great parents. They were always there for him and everything. Before we continue, I want to say that throughout the entire 3 paragraphs here, we see constant usage of pathos in his tone, in his sentencing, and everything. Let's go back to the purple, where it says, they were never like the Keatons, the Savers, the Huxtables, or any of the other parents I grew up on TV. Here we have allusions to TV show parents, which were probably carefree, funny parents with comedic things. Well, this is where he contrasts his parents as being reserved, obviously. As I said before, I'm going to say this a lot, very like personal, reserved. Let's go to the green, where it says, stayed away from doing stupid things like drugs or one day becoming a professional actor. They succeeded, and in other ways they didn't. Obviously, here we see situational irony, as Oriental parents usually want their children to have high respected jobs as doctors and scientists, and not like low seen jobs as like actors, like plumbers, or things like that. And well, obviously, we see the irony here, as Randall turned out to be an actor, something that his parents obviously did not want. Let's go to the yellow, where it says, wonder why they rarely ever share their personal stories with me. Never go into much detail. I've become obsessed with learning more about them. Something inside me just wanted to connect with them on a more human level, and I wanted to do it before it was too late. Here he connects back to his main purpose of not knowing who his parents are and how they would never share anything about them with Park. Here we can see how this turns into obsession in a later life as he states, I've become obsessed with learning more about them. He states through an emotional tone that before it's too late, he wants to connect to his parents. In the red we see, I'm okay with not knowing about their sex life though, which he connects back to the first part of comparison to American Parents. He uses obviously comedy to soften up the somber emotional tone we see throughout these 3 paragraphs. Here we learn a little bit more about his comedic personality and his funniness and everything. Then we see the last sentence where it says, all parents are in fact human beings with italicized. And then it says, with feeling and emotions, and unfortunately, an expiration date. Here he italicized human beings to emphasize that point that all parents are emotionally there for you. Obviously, they want the best for you. He connects, in some way, he's like connecting to us as readers and telling us that all parents are human beings who unfortunately like will pass away. But he's transmitting here in his purpose of telling his readers to learn the stories, connect with your parents before it's too late and the stories die off. Let's move on to paragraph 6 and 8, and let's start off with the yellow. What if I use this as an excuse to sit down with my parents and ask them everything I wanted to know? Then it's kind of academic, which means they'll be more likely to say yes, right? So let's look back at the sentence. Then it's kind of academic, which means they'll be more likely to say yes, right? Here we kind of get like a Korean identity, Korean ideas where obviously Korean culture like is very focalized on intelligence, education. And as I said before, with the professions, they want their children to become doctors and well respected in society. So he connects his parents with a cultural tone idea. Let's move on to the blue where it says, my mom, since she's always been the more communicative of my parents, likely to agree to do something like this. Artist in our family, she's a painter. My dad, on the other hand, is practical, hardworking, humble, and not one to waste words. No interest in being interviewed for this book. Here we can see the contrasting personalities of his parents. In the syntax, we can also see a mirroring of the parent's personality, where he makes his dad's description short and concise to match his father's straightforward, reserved personality. As we can see, my dad, comma, on the other hand, comma, is practical, comma, hardworking, comma, humble, comma, and not one to waste words. Here he's just being straight up, kind of describing his dad's personality. However, my mom, since she's always been the more communicative of my parents, likely to agree to do something like this, as she's the artist in our family. Here, he's like representing his mom as more carefree, a little bit more connective than his dad, and more likely to say yes to this interview that he's dying to do. Let's move on to the green where it says, I set out to meet my mom and my dad at Famous's Deli on Pico Boulevard in Los Angeles. I grew up having breakfast at Jewish delis with my family, so I figured the familiarity would help ease this process. I record them on my phone, and then we see this last sentence as painless as possible. So let's start off with that little portion of green. So here he's trying to sense a familiarity where he's trying to get his parents to be a little bit more open by trying to have them in a safe, comfortable spot where they can open up about themselves. However, let's move on to that last sentence where it says painless as possible. What does this mean? It makes the reader question, why would he describe this interview as possibly painful? Could it be the trauma that his parents possibly experienced in Korea, or the trouble they had in this new country, or anything? He doesn't know yet, and this is a very questioning as readers, as we want to know why this could possibly be painful. Paragraphs 9 to 12, we see, I learned more about my parents' past than I had in my entire life. So here he is saying that in that one interview that he had with his parents, he finally learns about his parents and achieves his purpose. This is like convincing or like enlightening the readers that this has actually worked and they should probably try it to learn more about their parents. So let's move on where it says, apparently my parents met when my dad went back for a visit to Korea. He was dirty and all his friends are getting married. Their families who have known each other in Taegu essentially set them up. My mom pretty much summed it up as an arranged situation. I was a little bummed to learn that the story wasn't more romantic, like the way my wife and I met. We were both sitting in an audition room, going up for the same part. Neither of us booked the part, but we ended up booking each other. According to my parents, in those times, things were more generally practical. So here, obviously, we get a comparison of his parents' relationship and him and his wife's relationship. So we can see a contrasting in like cultures, maybe, where his parents are Korean, very serious, not that much into, obviously, or as he says, arranged situation, not that much into romance, very, very serious. While he states that him and his wife, as the American culture, like very romantic, very like feelings. They demonstrate their feelings a lot. He uses once again, as I said before, comedy. Neither of us picked the part, but we ended up picking each other. Once again, seeing Park's personality. But when I got here, I was really disappointed, full of disappointment, because in reality, your dad was poor. And as a young girl, I was 20, 21, I thought when I come here, I would have some sort of standard of living, like in the movies, but we didn't. We struggled. So obviously, this is the mother's perspective where she shares a somber tone and where she shares her experience from moving to an unknown country and having to make the most out of it. We can see how her sentences are short, concise, straight to the point to emphasize that this was not the life that they expected. She expected rich, like new experiences, job opportunities, but when they got here, they struggled. They didn't know the language. They had to start from zero, no friends, and had to get jobs. Let's move on to the green, where it says this theme of struggle seemed to permeate throughout the entire interview. And despite the fact that these struggles were often shielded from my brother and me, they would play a major role in upbringing. So, as in the whole story of American Like Me, we see that struggle is a major theme throughout all these immigrants, as they don't feel connected either to where they are, they feel disconnected, they feel like an outsider because they don't connect to like the American culture. But however, we see the opposite in Randall, where he sees that he's struggling to connect with the Korean culture. So, and we also see the struggles of his parents and trying to make the best for them. In the closing statement, we see, I not only got closer to my parents, but I also got closer to myself. There was always a part of me that felt like an outsider. I was never quite Korean enough. Upon hearing the stories, I began to feel more anchored to both sides of me, to where I am today and how my story is directly connected to theirs. These stories remind me that I am the person who is here in this country for a reason. So obviously here we see paradoxical phrasing and how he shows in the end of the interview, he fixes and solves his culture identity. Here we look back, it says, I was never quite Korean enough and that I felt like an outsider. Contrast to where he says, these stories remind me of the person I am who is here in this country for a reason. So here he is stating that he solves that culture crisis he had with the Korean identity and how he now, by learning his parents, he kind of feels more like leaned toward it and feels both his Korean and American the same way. So let's move on to the yellow, where it says, is it because I paid for breakfast? Is it because of their undying love for the sisterhood of the traveling pants? I'll get back to you on that. Obviously, another representation of comedy, another more insight to Park's personality and identity, where he breaks all of this pathos, this tone, and just puts some comedy in there. My original plan was to publish the entire interview, but now I kind of feel weird about doing that. For now, I want to hold on to this experience for myself. Besides, this interview will be more meaningful to me than any of you. Park states that the true meaning of this interview and what it meant enough to be kept as personal, as he first stated that his purpose was to discover more about his parents and publish the entire interview. But however, he found it to be personal and a private part of him that he now shares with his parents, as that human connection he was searching for has been found. So then he continues to say, to you, I say, collect your own stories from your parents, your grandparents, your guardians, your mentors. Then pass these stories down to your kids, your grandkids, and anyone who can really benefit from them. And if you're having trouble getting to these stories, try to make an event out of it. Here is where we see, like in the story, where he states the purpose of saying the story. He is saying to sit down with your parents or any like relatives that you have, like with different cultures or that are immigrants and has to struggle through American and get used to this American culture that takes time and has to like, you have to get used to it. And he's saying to sit down, learn about the stories, learn about the struggles, and learn about your parents' culture or any relative's culture before it's too late and these stories die off. He says, then he closes off, oh, and I also make sure to do it somewhere meaningful and not while she's on this toilet. Of course, Randall had to close off with a comedic statement, as this was his story, perfect way to close it off. And well, in the end, he achieved his purpose. He connected to his parents in a cultural and human connection level and an emotional level. And he got what he wanted, the interview, and learned a little bit more about his culture. Thank you so much for watching the video.